Hello, my name is Una Dalia, and I'm going to be the lecturer for the fall term of Art History 120. I've taught this course for many years, and I love teaching this course because there's so much rich, unimaginable, unbelievable art and history that we have a chance to discuss. But I'd like to say, first of all, that I feel very strange about the fact that this year I'm talking to a camera in front of a green screen rather than being able to discuss this directly with you. And so I'd like to encourage you, please do send me an email, get in contact if you have any questions or concerns or just want to talk about the art, or stop by in my virtual office hours. Now, to get all of the detailed information about the structure of the course, the timing, the optional tutorials, assignments, and tests, this is all listed in absolutely fine detail on the syllabus, which is posted on Q. If you have any questions about this material, again, don't hesitate to contact me. This course is a roughly chronological survey that takes you from the earliest art we know, prehistoric art, right all the way through what we call the Western tradition, leading from antiquity straight through to the contemporary period, to today. And so in the fall term, we'll start by discussing prehistoric cave art, and then the ancient art of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. And then through the Middle Ages, we'll be looking at soaring cathedrals and mosques. We'll be looking at delicate manuscript illuminations, monumental sculpture, tapestry, stained glass, among other media. And then towards the end of the fall term, we'll start to talk about the Renaissance, this time of a rebirth of interest in classical antiquity, a new renewal in science, all sorts of experiments, both with art that is grandly heroic and with the strange and monstrous and sometimes erotic. After the fall term and the winter term, one of my colleagues will be taking you then from the late Renaissance straight through to modern and contemporary art. For the remainder of this brief lecture, I'd like to give you a more personal introduction to what art means in my life and where I come from. This is not material on which you will be tested, and so please feel free, if you'd like, skip the rest of this video and move on to looking at the video on prehistoric art. My specialty is the Italian Renaissance. I've published on a wide variety of subjects, such artists as Titian, Raphael, Michelangelo. If you haven't heard these names before, these are names that will become familiar to you by the end of the term. I've worked on a wide variety of objects, sculptures, prints, paintings, drawings, buildings, some tiny, some huge. My current research focuses on Italian Renaissance polychrome sculpture. That is, sculptures that were fully painted, so they seem to have a living skin. These are sculptures that blush and bleed. These often life-size, very vividly naturalistic works were treated like they were living bodies in the Renaissance. And so people would often put actual clothing, actual fabric clothing, onto these sculptures. And so, for example, women would lend their dresses to a sculpture and then ask for it back. And sculptures would have different costumes to wear for different occasions. Likewise, many of these sculptures have hinges in the joints so that they could be placed in different positions during theatrical performances. In other words, in the Renaissance, sculptures were actors. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time in Art History 120 to discuss any of these specific works. But this kind of attitude towards art The idea that art is not something confined to museums, not something that's mere decoration or only for an elite, but something that is very much a part of life that's living, is what I hope to convey to you in the first half of Art History 120. I grew up with art, but not mostly with Renaissance art. I grew up more with modern art and architecture. And so my grandparents, my family moved a lot, and my grandparents lived in Litchfield, Connecticut the whole time I was growing up. So even though we moved to different places, we'd always go back every summer to my grandparents' house, which was this slice of a modern house, very contemporary. And modernist architecture has this reputation for being cold and inhuman, a mere box. But my grandparents' house was anything but. It was made by the very famous modern architect, Marcel Breuer, a Bauhaus architect, and it was full of light and life. So when you came inside the house, it was full of light, one space flowing into the next. It was relaxing, calm, but at the same time, totally lovely and warm. And it was filled with the personality of my grandparents, whom I adored. They were the most warm, generous, earthy, funny, cultured, unpretentious people you ever met. And I loved coming there. When I was at university, I went to school nearby, and so I would come to visit. This is where I got married. This is where I brought my baby children just before my grandparents died. Just to give you a sense of the role art played in my life, this is a sculpture that was on my grandparents' coffee table. It's about this big, not very large now. It's in a museum in Connecticut where nobody can play with it, but I definitely played with it. And so it's made out of painted sheet metal. And the head of the dragon, the black part with the yellow and the blue tongue, is not actually affixed to the body. It just balances there on top of that pointy red neck. And likewise, those yellow, I'm not sure what they are, ears, flaps, gills, whatever, hang and balance there, as does the tongue. And so I would take it off, I would spin it around, I'd blow hard on it and make it dance. And this was the attitude that I had towards art. Art is something with which you play. Art is something joyful, a little bit sharp, maybe slightly dangerous, and potentially a little bit rude. So my grandfather wanted one of these chairs, modern chair, really exciting looking, like a series of floating shapes. It looks almost like an impossible structure that couldn't hold the weight of somebody. Designed by a man by the name of Gerrit Rietveld. And at that point, it was really expensive to buy one of those chairs, so he wasn't going to do that. And there was no way to get the measurements. So this is one of these don't do this moments where I tell you, please don't do this yourselves. But my grandfather, who actually had an artificial leg from World War II, climbed over a barrier in the Museum of Modern Art with a tape measure and took down the dimensions of the red and blue chair. And then he went home and made a bunch of chairs himself. And I loved this chair. It was somewhere comfortable to sit and read, but it was also a slide for my stuffed animals. It was a kind of miniature playground. It was something fantastic. And this is how I want you to be able to begin to feel about art. Art is something that you live with. And you know, it looks like a beautiful, floating, strange torture instrument. But this chair is actually remarkably comfortable. In fact, when we can all return to campus, I warmly encourage you to come to my office in Ontario Hall, come see me, and come try the chair, and then you'll see what I mean. So my grandparents not only taught me to think of modern art as something lively and warm and exciting, but also older art, including Renaissance art. So I have a memory of being quite young, I'm not sure, maybe 7 or 8. I know I was holding my grandfather's hand and looking up, so I couldn't have been very old. And he took me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we were there in the early Italian painting gallery, looking at this painting. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but when you go to museums, people tend to have this hushed, reverential attitude. And the older the art is, the more they have a tendency to barely speak, to nod their heads and to say, sort of sagely. And I think it's maybe out of the feeling of panic that they don't know what to say about the art. And so they feel as if they have to be very serious about it. And everybody's very, very quiet, as if something will break or explode if they speak in an animated way about the art. Well, my grandfather wasn't like that. He was never a very quiet man, and he was an unpretentious man. And he was really excited about this painting. It's not a very big painting, about this big. And the story here is just after the birth of baby Jesus. Don't worry if you don't know these stories. It's a wonderful thing that our students come from a wide variety of cultural traditions, and we'll go over all of the stories as the course progresses. But just to tell you this one right now, so the woman lying down here in the dark blue cloak is the Virgin Mary. And she's just given birth to baby Jesus, who for Christians is both God and man. And he's here in the foreground all wrapped up in swaddling. And then the man on this side, bending over and leaning forward in gold and blue, is Mary's husband, Joseph. And these other 3 figures in the foreground are the 3 kings who are coming to give presents to the newborn baby. My grandfather, when he took me to see this painting, he said, "Look, Uni," because that's what he called me. He said, "Look, Uni, look at Joseph. Joseph is saying, 'Don't drop the baby.'" And of course, he shouted it. I've actually taken the volume down a little, believe it or not. He shouted it. And everybody in the gallery who was sitting there sagely, quietly nodding, looked over as if he'd committed some horrible crime. Because my grandfather was excited about the art and he was seeing it in a human way. My grandfather probably wasn't technically correct, because Joseph actually has, I'm not sure if you can see, but a little red pot in his hand, which means he's leaning over to receive one of the gifts that the 3 kings have bought. But my grandfather was correct in that Giotto's art, and the art of the Renaissance in general, is lively, warm, funny, earthy, and alive. Why do we study art history? Well, I have found in my own experience that not only can you learn to appreciate a work of art intellectually by studying it, but that you can actually learn to love it and to see it in a way that you didn't before. So for example, when I, after my first year of university, went for the first time to Italy, I was in Venice, and I went to one of the major sites there, the Doge's Palace. And I remember thinking, this is just one blacky brown, dull, leaden, boring painting after another. Felt like kilometers and kilometers of dull, boring canvases. And so when a couple of years later I went back to Venice, I almost didn't go to the Doge's palace. I'd had such a negative memory of it, being this horrible, boring place. But by that point, I had decided I'd fallen in love with art history. I'd decided this was my life's work. I had studied Venetian painting of the 16th century, and I thought, okay, I really have to go. And so I went. And they hadn't cleaned the paintings or anything. The paintings were physically the same. They were lit in the same way. But because I had studied them, it was like this veil had been drawn away. And I could see how lively and colorful and strange they were. And so, for example, this painting shows Vulcan's forge. Vulcan is the ancient pagan god of fire. And he's here hammering at his anvil, making weaponry. This building used to be Venice's government building. And so this is a very clear political message to visitors from other states. Watch out. We are strong and powerful and we can make these weapons. Okay, but if you keep looking at it and you start thinking about it realistically, you're going to say, wait a minute, if people were actually forging weapons at a blacksmith's shop, would they be naked? Probably not. That would be somewhat dangerous in terms of flying sparks. Another sort of obvious thing is, if you were going to be trying to strike and shape metal, would you be kneeling on the ground and twisting into all of these weird poses? No, because you'd have zero leverage in order to work the metal. You need to use your body weight while standing, as any blacksmith could tell you. So this is not so much about realism, but about creating this image. The figures are naked so that you can see their bulging muscles. You can see the great strength of Venice. They're in twisting poses to show how hard this work is and to animate the scene. And they're kneeling down so that it compresses and tightens the composition so that if they stood up, they'd be giants. And that makes it all the more forceful a message. Likewise, this other painting in the same room shows the Three Graces. The Three Graces are also another ancient pagan image, this time of the three figures who were thought to preside over the arts. So rather than war, this refers to peace and culture. And rather than seeing three women in any kind of realistic pose, there's sort of, I mean, think about it. Think about trying these poses with two of your friends. You'd fall over because they're kind of halfway between standing and sitting and kneeling, almost strangely floating, twisting around with one another. But that again compresses the figures and adds tension and life. Also, look at the lighting here. Look at the way it's as if it's sunlit, but through the leaves of a tree, so that light and shade are dappled over their nude bodies, which calls attention to their soft and sensuous flesh, more than harsh, clear, even lighting would do. These paintings, as I realized after I'd studied them, were alive. They were absolutely political messages about how strong in its military presence of Venice and how cultured it was, but also they were visceral, living figures who really embodied this Venetian ideal. We study art history to learn to see things anew. We also study art history to discover strange and marvelous things you've probably never seen before, such as this painting, which was made 2,000 years ago for the dining room of a Roman empress, the Empress Livia, the wife of the Emperor Augustus. And this dining room is painted on all sides, all four walls and the ceiling, with this illusionistic garden. So it was as if she was standing in a garden. And it's just as fresh and lively, with the fruits and flowers and birds and trees that seem to quiver in the wind, as when it was painted 2,000 years ago. We also study art history in order to be able to understand something more about some of the most famous monuments. So you've probably seen Michelangelo's early Pietà. It's so often reproduced that it's become like a cliche. As you can see here, you can get a keychain with the Pietà on it. You can get Pietà-shaped plates, soaps, snow globes, etc. And so it becomes hard to look at these objects. It becomes hard for us to see them anew until we do art history. And so the actual story here is a terribly tragic one. This is again from the Christian tradition. And you see, we saw before the painting of the Virgin Mary just after the birth of her son Jesus. Well, this is later, after Jesus has died on the cross and his mother is holding the body of her dead son in her lap. It's a terrible thing no mother should ever have to do. And in order to see how strange and new Michelangelo's way of seeing the scene is, we can turn to earlier images of the same subject. Don't worry about the details now. We'll come back to Michelangelo's Pietà later in the term. I just want to be able to illustrate for you what art history can do. And so this is a typical earlier image of the Pietà. It's carved out of wood rather than marble and fully painted. And so you can see the colors have darkened somewhat and it's a bit dirty, but you can see red blood gushing out of the side of Jesus and out of his hands and feet in great three-dimensional cascades that have been sculpted here. Because this is wood rather than marble, the head can hang jerkily off to the side, and the whole body looks broken and painfully thin. And the mother, Mary, herself is realistically a middle-aged woman, her face drawn in a kind of agony of sorrow, her lips slightly parted as if she's calling out, "Ay me, that my son should have come to this," as is written in the devotional handbooks. Now turn again to the Michelangelo. It doesn't look so cliched and so much like a classic anymore. Instead, you can see what is so startlingly new and strange and almost perverse about what Michelangelo does with the scene. He has it all in white, unpainted marble with this kind of unearthly pallor. He makes the figures look delicate and beautiful. All of that horror and violence are gone. We can barely see Jesus' wounds. If you don't look carefully, you'd think he's asleep. And Mary is so very young. She doesn't look old enough to have an adult son over whom she can mourn. And so Michelangelo has created this kind of lyrical poem, almost the horror of the passion, but recollected in tranquility, made that horror strangely sweet. All of this we can see anew. It's like the invention is happening in front of us by doing the work of art history. Art history today is a diverse and lively field. The history of art overlaps with histories of politics, economics, religion, science, gender, and literature. In this course, we will be studying the strange and powerful role that art played in past cultures and continues to play in our own. In other words, take a seat. You're in for a weird and wonderful ride.